Hello, this is our diversity research presentation. We chose the topic sex drive issues across diverse demographic, and how we kind of split this up is we each took a demographic to research. And then for that fourth demographic, we took different aspects of that demographic to research that will play into sex drive implications. So we will start with Latinx culture. I'm going to go to the next slide. In 2017, the article Integration of Sex and Sexuality into Counseling Programs states that counselors are taught that different cultures communicate, eat, dress, and interact differently. However, the way these cultures view sexual interaction and intimacy is lacking in counselor education programs. Therapists must consider intercultural relationships and how sex drive and race or ethnicity intersect and affect sexual expression, interaction, and intimacy. When looking at sex drive and sexuality in Latinx culture, particularly in Latina culture, it's stated Latina sexuality, as well as that of other women of color, has been talked about, written about, and studied mostly by others. It is important to keep in mind the implications surrounding sex drive and sexuality when working with Latinx cultures. Sorry, I need to get to that. Sue Alford warns of generalizing Latinx cultures by saying, Hispanic people represent a variety of cultures, assets, and achievements. In fact, this highly diverse group may share only one characteristic, that they were born in or can trace their family roots to countries in Latin America. There are, however, certain characteristics that could fall into the majority category. First would be a collectivist society that is an emphasis on the needs and goals of the community and family over the needs and goals of the individual. In my own cultural immersion project, the gentleman I interviewed, he talked about his personal goal being that of just being able to provide for his family. Another characteristic is traditional gender roles. That is to say, very patriarchal. This plays a very big role in sex drive implications, and we'll talk about that later. And finally, a large majority of Latinx culture is very traditional in their religious views. According to a Pew Research study, roughly 83% of Latinx individuals claim religious affiliation. 62% of that population claim Catholicism as their religion, and 19% as Protestant. This is in stark contrast to white Americans who claim about 50% Protestant and 23% Catholic. Because of this, there are also some very conservative views regarding sex drive, and sexuality. Gender roles. First, there are two very important terms that are often used, machismo and marianismo. Machismo comes from the Spanish and Portuguese macho. This is an emphasis on being manly and self-reliant. In the books Families in Global and Multicultural Perspective, Susan Smith and Bron Inglesby say that the major characteristic of machismo is hypersexuality. The impotent and homosexual are scoffed at. The culturally preferred goal is the conquest of women. Other characteristics of machismo include confidence or bravado and social dominance. In the impact of machismo on Hispanic women, Rosa Resnick and Yolanda Mayo state that the power difference in the relationship between men and women not only creates the social norms of machismo, but by consequence creates the social concept of marianismo. Marianismo is the female gender role in Latinx communities. It's characterized by the cultural expectation that a woman be passive and submissive, along with being sexually pure. These traits respond to those prescribed by machismo, which expects the man to be active, aggressive, and sexually experienced. Marianismo can trace its roots to the Spanish colonization of Latin America and the religious beliefs that came with it, which was Roman Catholic. The term actually means devotion to Maria, or the Virgin Mary. These two roles really create a dichotomy where the men are supposed to have a high sex drive and be sexually active, while the women are both expected to maintain their chastity while also being subservient to men. in a changing and globalizing world, one researcher looked on to how these affected traditional gender roles in Latinx communities. Um, uh, they found that the collectivist mentality sustained the gender roles, and the mother would teach the children about the social norms of machismo and Marianismo. The children would observe and emulate their parents, and it actually just created a cycle. Um, in the traditional household, the man is expected to work and provide for his family, and the wife is supposed to stay home and care for the children. Because of this, fathers are often seen as this distant authoritative figure, while the mothers assume the majority of the responsibility in this domestic realm. Sue Alford states that Hispanic families often offer closer mother-child relationships and more open expression of physical and verbal affection than do Euro-American families. And that Latino child-rearing practices often emphasize receiving support from the family rather than developing individualistic self-reliance, which goes back to that collectivist society. If we go to the sex drive implications slide, religion plays a large role in Latinx views of sex drive and sexuality. As stated earlier, the majority of Latinos subscribe to Roman Catholic traditions. This means that most individuals hold conservative traditional views regarding sexuality and gender roles. Women are expected to emulate the Virgin Mary, and the men are expected to be dominant in this patriarchal society. Because of these views, they may feel uncomfortable or even unwilling to discuss sex drive or sexuality. And finally, it is important not to assume that the presenting problems regarding sex drive are linked to these gender roles. Counseling implications, if we go to the next slide. Just as with any counseling interaction, it is important to check your own bias regarding sex drive and gender roles. It is also important to realize that the client may or may not adhere to these roles. Men may subscribe to the concept of machismo, or they may not. In the same way, women may or may not follow Marianismo traditions. It is important to learn the individual. Counselors should also be aware and avoid oversimplifying the culture. In the book, Migrant Men, the author states, generalizing about Latin American men as a comprehensible category is difficult because the differences between them are often as great as the similarities. We must be careful not to oversimplify common traits among men in this world region. In the same vein, Oliva Espin states, despite shared features of history and culture, attitudes towards sex role are extremely diverse among Hispanic women. For instance, some Latin women are willing to endorse modern and liberated sex roles concerning education and employment, while maintaining very traditional conservative positions concerning sexual behavior or personal relationships. Others are traditional in all respects, and still others reject all traditional beliefs concerning the roles of women. Finally, when working with clients from Latinx communities, it is important to allow the client to define the problem and utilize a strength-based approach. As our textbook from this class says, determine the positive assets and resources available to the client and his or her family. Have they, other family members, or friends successfully dealt with similar problems? These are just things to keep in mind when interacting and counseling sex drive implications in Latinx communities.
Awesome. Thanks, Sam. So our next demographic that I chose to kind of look at is the Chinese population. So on the next slide, something that I found fascinating with this population is how their cultural traditions, political history, and their economic transformations as of recent tie into their sex drive. So just looking at some of the history, in 1949, China became communist, and it affected a big baby boom. And that affected so much that by 1979, they implemented a one-child policy, which led to the growth, and not solely the reason, but it led to the growth of prostitution. And then only in 2015 did the one-child policy become abolished. And they figured that there would be a baby boom thereafter, but there wasn't. So just the fact that the political history alone had so much effect within the sex drive was one of the things that first caught my eye to this. But preceding the history, if we took a look at the next slide and look at the traditional Chinese culture, everything that they cater to is supposed to have a low sex drive. So they're very collectivistic over individualistic, meaning that you are brought into this world to honor your family, and everything that you do needs to be centered around them. If you stray from that, then you are going to bring dishonor, or something harmful may happen to you or your family. When sexual education is taught within the schools, there's more of a biological and moral implication. So they'll teach the biology of it, but then it'll implement a moral aspect of, if you have sex before marriage, or if you don't follow these rules, then shame will come to your family. And that's a lot of pressure for someone to handle, along with there's no research done about the pleasure, or very minimal, and it's focused around a moral and biological base. They do hold strong values, and one of those strong values is arranged marriages. So there alone, their marriages are based upon an economic and family gain rather than love, or just wanting to have that pleasure for themselves. Traditionally, the bigger the body, then the more wealthy you were. So you were able to afford the food and the clothes that it took to maintain your body. And still today, China has the biggest sex ratio difference. So what that means is there's 118 men to 100 women. And we'll take more of a closer look at that later on. And just some interesting facts that I found. And these were all done before 2015. So I would imagine that some of the statistics are either higher or lower. But it showed that 12% of college students are satisfied with their body image, which is interesting that if you go back to their traditional beliefs, if you had a bigger body, then you were considered more wealthy and better for your family. But 62% of students said that they want to have a slimmer body. And approximately 20% of men have had a one-night stand, and 9% of women. So even though they're supposed to have more of a conservative belief, there's still that 1 in 5 men are able to have, or do choose to have, one-night stands, and at least almost 1 in 10 women. And so along with this, even though their traditions are supposed to have more of a lower suppressed sex drive, there's some changing cultural norms. For example, within the last 10 years, there's been an increase in porn downloads and prostitution. Now, some of the porn downloads is due to the increase within the technological world. The younger population has shown a decrease in the traditional values and has taken more of a westernized approach to how they live their everyday life and view sexuality. It is shown that wages in prostitution, you can make up 5 to 10 times more of your salary than you would in a factory. So when it comes to your family, that's a big chunk of money that they're more able to make just going out and prostituting some nights instead of working every day in the factory. And then the growth of prostitution. They predicted that by the end of 2020, 17% of men will have solicited a prostitute, which is astounding to think about when just right before 2015, 20% of men were having a one-night stand. And now almost that percentage will have at least solicited a prostitute, not even looking at the other potential mates that they could have. And then looking at the men to women ratio, already men have a hard time finding a wife and able to have someone that they share their life with, since there is less women in China. But as women become educated and hold strong to their religious beliefs, they restrict themselves to having those sexual experiences and are able to be more picky with the husbands that they choose. So looking at resistance and advocacy, counseling is not honorable to them. when you have issues, you're supposed to handle it within your family. If you go outside of the family, that's dishonorable. So a lot of Chinese people have not had exposure to counselors. And then with the ever-changing economic status, political, social, there's so much misinformation, especially with the growth of the internet and anyone able to get on and influence the information. And then the lack of diversity within the counseling world. When the Chinese population want to go and seek a counselor and no one looks like them, that's pretty intimidating to go in and expect someone else to understand your traditions and values. So a way we can advocate for them is just getting that education out, whether it's speakers through universities, support groups, websites, especially for bigger cities like Beijing and Hong Kong who have access to technology really quickly. But then educational pamphlets and being able to have those paper copies for people that might not have the technological means. And also looking at pursuing law revisions on internet pornography access. That's a problem within our youth, and maybe, even in China, they need to look at what they're doing to restrict that. And then also being respectful that they may need counseling, but they may not want to bring their family name into it. So having an anonymous counseling hotline will help them at least receive the generalization of counseling and talking to someone, but not having to share such personal things of who they are, what they look like, and where that they live. So looking at counseling implications, when you look at school counseling, making sure we're incorporating more health and safety concerns about sexual education rather than moral dilemmas when teaching them about sex education, and keeping our own biases out of it. And having an emphasis on building a client-counselor relationship and informing about the confidentiality policies. The more we can educate, the better that they will be growing up. Mental health counseling, since they do like more of the factual statistical stuff, approaching it with a psychoeducational approach. It'll help them decipher what their symptoms are and what they're feeling. And then with family counseling, let them present the problem and counsel with a strength-based approach. It can be really intimidating to talk to multiple family members, and just making sure they feel comfortable and listened to. That's all for me so far.
Thank you, Rachel. And I'm just going to pick up on the demographic population that I chose, and that would be Arab women. Traditional Arabic culture, collectivist and patriarchal culture, where the man or the father in the family has the first and last say of what's going to go on in that household. It's also important to remember that Arab just basically specifies that these are Arabic-speaking individuals. It's not necessarily regarding a race of people. So when you hear the word Arab, it typically is referring to a language being spoken. So the religions that are associated with Arabic culture are Christianity, Judaism, Islam, but it's not limited to those. Sexual desire and sex in general can be considered taboo topics among Arabs and Muslims. In Arab societies, you'll see women wearing veils and full-length body attire. You'll see them wearing full-length body attire, and that's basically to present themselves as modest. One thing to note is that Arab men in the society are not expected or required to demonstrate such modesty to the extent that women are. And some women will actually wear full face veils so that none of their face besides their eyes are visible. And as far as gender roles in this society, depending on the particular culture or country or region, women are expected to be subordinate to the men in the culture. So I asked a simple question, does modesty equal the absence of sexual desire? I believe it does not. I do not believe that when someone outwardly expresses themselves as modest and inhibit their sexual desires or sexualized behavior, that does not indicate that there is an absence of that desire within the individual. I also made a note that this can create the stage for numerous internal struggles among Arab women who have yet to discover themselves as sexual healthy beings. From a peer-reviewed article that I was able to find from the school's database, I found some interesting quotes on Arab society and sexuality. And just a little background on the Islamic woman who was the subject of this. She basically believed that Arab culture has been written and rewritten about by Western cultures. She felt that Arab literatures on sex and other topics in that area were being shoved down, and she wanted to bring some light back to that. So here are some interesting quotes that I found from this article. It is as if the modern Arabic language underwent a castration that created sexual inhibition and distancing from the language's rich history, a past in which sexual subjects were still treated as part of science, of theology, and of the harmony of the believer's body, soul, and the cosmos. Arab society today has interiorized all the Western notion of sin and guilt associated with the body. And this is coming directly from the author who's being written about in this article. She says, "Why was it possible for me to take pride in my reading of Western and Eastern pornography while hiding the fact that I was reading al-Tafashi?" All right, and that's basically saying that Western media, promotes the sexualization of their culture, whereas in Arab culture, sexualization has been repressed through different dimensions in that culture. So she's just wanting to shine some light on that issue. Three big issues that I was able to come up with when researching this issue. Arab women face social and religious pressure to suppress their sexual desires and sexualized behavior. That can be an issue in cases where women who have higher sex drives. What type of support can they receive if they are not able to share those things in a religious setting or in a family setting? We want to make sure that they are able to get the help that they need. So a desired outcome that I would like to see from that would be Arab women are able to live within their cultural context as healthy sexual beings while maintaining a dignified, individualized, and private lifestyle. I would like to communicate to them that sex is a natural biological element of human life. So we have to better educate people on that. Arab women have limited resources to voice their feelings about sex from a personal or general perspective. Once again, cultural and religious pressures can really suppress their voices in regard to the topic of sex. The desired outcome. Arab women have a safe place to discuss sexual topics. Counseling centers and support groups work closely with this population to ensure that they have access to mental health resources as well as pregnancy care and other essential healthcare services. So once again, just want to make sure that they are able to receive that service in private without facing persecution from other forces. Arab women may be subjected to sexual abuse in a culture that demands its women to behave and dress modestly, while it does not hold the men to as high of a standard of modest sexual behavior. I think that can be dangerous in the case of men being held to a lower standard than the women. I believe that can create a dangerous atmosphere and set the stage for potential abuse on a physical, a verbal, and emotional level. Desired outcome would be Arab women have the same cultural, political, legal freedom to explore themselves as sexual beings as Arab men do. So a couple of approaches that I was able to locate in regard to how high and low sex drives are evaluated in a clinical sense. Both hypoactive and hyperactive sex drives in female clients will be evaluated for psychiatric disorders and other organic causes to explain those higher or low sex drives. Psychological dimensions of both types of sex drives are also considered when evaluating the client. So I would just like to expand on that by saying that, you definitely want to consider the psychosocial elements that play a part in a client's lack of sexual desire or excessive sexual desire. There are other things that play a part in that than just genetic factors. So a counselor should be very careful when looking into that. Possible reasons for resistance or desired outcomes: religious beliefs, social pressure, especially from the men that may really, harp on women who are not behaving in the traditional sense. You got the possibility of dishonoring the family unit. As I stated earlier, this is a collectivist culture. So when the individual makes a poor decision or a dishonorable decision, there's the possibility of dishonoring the entire family unit. So that's another thing that might resist treatment. Personal moral values against sexual expression or sexualized behavior. Those feelings may come up in counseling and really halt progress. Potential financial loss due to behaviors and values inconsistent with the majority of Arab culture. You can be ostracized for expressing yourself in this way. Potential targeting of verbal and physical attacks. As I stated previously, abuse is a concern that could be bred in this type of culture. Not in all cases, but it's something to carefully evaluate. And then the lack of trust between the counselor and the client can be another reason for resistance in treatment. So for advocacy strategies with this group, I'd love to see the creation of Arab women support groups that partner with other women's rights agencies, and to see that their aim be to educate these women about healthy living, especially as it relates to sex, and internalized sexual feelings. I'd like to see the creation of safe places and shelters for abused Arab women who are seeking an escape from their abusers. And I'd also like to advocate for more Arab women to become mental health counselors so that other Arab women have more culturally sensitive professionals available to them. So counseling implications. On the side of school counseling, the school counselor needs to be careful and be culturally competent in regard to young Arab women because they do face social and religious pressures. So when they are behaving in a certain way or not behaving in a certain way, these questions need to be asked. And I made a note here that especially during stages of puberty where young adults are entering their stage of being a sexual being, you do need to have culturally competent counselors in that regard. For family counseling, once again, in a collectivist family, the counselor needs to be sensitive to the desires of the family just as much as the client, so that they don't unintentionally encourage the client to do something that might dishonor the collectivist family. So it's always important to know where the family stands on an issue before directing the individual away from that. In clinical mental health counseling, counselors and clinicians must be careful not to over-pathologize an Arab woman's high or low sexual desire. Once again, cultural factors are involved in that, and they need to be carefully evaluated before handing out diagnoses.
So our last demographic is looking at us, so looking at the American population, and we found that there's so much research about the sex drive of Americans that we decided to break it down by looking at the media, gender roles, and faith, and then coming back to look at the counseling implications in advocacy groups. So looking at the media, this is just a basic timeline of the sexualization that has happened within the media, starting all the way back from 1885 when the first men's magazine, Photo Bits, was published. And I'm actually going to jump up to 1993 when the internet is established. And then within 1996, that was the first time that since sexualization had become more prominent within the media, that we have tried to regulate some of that. So the Communications Decency Act was passed to regulate the porn industry. And around that time, it was worth $50 million. But jumping to 2009, it was then worth $4.9 billion and steadily growing. And then just in 2015, the Brock-Turner rule, it was a court case, non-consensual sex is removed from pornographic sites. And that was the first time that that was passed as a law, which is pretty recent. So it's kind of interesting to look at how throughout the years we've steadily gained more and more access to all of this, and we are just recently trying to put restrictions on all of this. Continuing on to the next site, there's a common theme of sexualizing women within the media. Not saying that men do not get sexualized as well, but it's just more common for women. Looking at the statistics within men's magazines, 76% of the time a woman is within the magazines, they are being objectified or put into some provocative pose or clothing. 18% of girls within the US by the time they are 17 have been sexually abused, and 10 to 25% of adolescents have sex. And on the flip side of that, a greater percentage have received them. So what this tells us is media encourages submissive, scantily attired, young, preferably lighter complexioned women. And it does, again, like I said, sexualize men. They prefer fit, manly men within the media. And so with this research and looking at articles, the media is correlated with making Americans have a higher sex drive comparatively to other countries. And this is one of the problems and the issues that we are facing even today within the media.
And I'll pick up on the religious values as it pertains to American culture. The religious landscape study conducted by the Pew Research Center in 2014 reported these percentages of each religion's prevalence in the U.S. At a whopping 70.6%, 7 out of 10 of the individuals in this country subscribe to some Christian belief. About 23% are unaffiliated, and about 6% subscribe to a non-Christian faith. So really, I'm going to take a big focus on this large chunk, the 70% of Christians that live in America. So for Christianity, as I just stated, it's the most widely observed religion in America. And American marriages typically include a verbal and spiritual commitment being made to God by the newlyweds to stay married, even during difficult times. So why does the godly commitment typically end in divorce? Research shows that 40 to 50% of U.S. marriages end in divorce. Marriages that occur after one or both of the individuals have already been divorced are even more likely to end in divorce than their first marriages. And then I posed another question of, could premarital sex be to blame for leading people into physical relationships before a mental and emotional and even a spiritual connection have been established? So I'm going to look into pop culture and versus religious values and how they clash. So many people have expressed concerns that pop culture and just in general, American values have shifted away from Christian values. And here are a couple of examples. Sex-related businesses are now publicly advertised. You know, you'll see them in magazines, you'll see ads on web pages. They're in your face now. They're not as discreet as they once were. Pornography remains a multi-billion-dollar industry. As Rachel just went over, the porn industry is worth about $5 billion right now. So the industry is thriving off of sexualized individuals. Social media feeds are filled with individuals who promote their bodies in revealing outfits. We've had corruption or different scandals pop up in various religious institutions. Some Americans prefer the microwave product over the long anticipated one. So when you think about religion, there's normally a ultimate payoff at the end of following the creator's will. That obviously takes a long time, where some Americans have adapted to the microwave approach in America, where you get it when you want it. Instant gratification, I should say. Sexual liberation has been a popular topic over the past several decades, which may conflict with religious teachings. And then a statistic that I thought to be pretty shocking was that by age 44, 95% of Americans will have had premarital sex, according to a 2006 study. So what's the issue? Well, there are several issues that can occur when religious beliefs clash with social norms. All right, one is cognitive dissonance. So in the case of someone who really appreciates the look of their body, but get the feeling that showing their body is wrong, is morally wrong. So you may be a bodybuilder, for say, or a swimsuit model, and you may be feeling feelings of that cognitive dissonance, causing shame and uncomfortability. There's exclusion from religious groups. And impulsive decision-making to avoid uncomfortable thought processes. You can have one-night stands pop up from this situation. Maybe drinks or substances are involved. And it's just making an impulsive decision rather than a well-thought-out one. Marital issues related to the lack of knowledge about sex. So while sex has become a taboo issue, especially in a lot of religious institutions, lack of knowledge about sex can create its own issues, especially within marriage and in relationships, intimate relationships. Sex education is important for human development, and this type of education requires seeking of knowledge beyond the walls of the church. And you can see that in health classes, support groups, and just general counseling in some cases.
One large influence of sex drive in America is gender role and how it has and continues to change over time. Defining gender roles in America can be difficult because there's been such significant changes in those, particularly over the last 70 years. With the end of World War II, post-war America, the Civil Rights Movement, and the rise of American media influence. Going back to the media influence, in his book, Media, Gender, and Identity, David Gauntlet states that with the media containing so many images of women and men and messages about men, women, and sexuality today, it is very unlikely that these would have no impact on our own sense of identity. He even goes so far as to say that our current gender roles may very well be defined by media. This influence can be viewed, charted, and fairly accurately quantified all the way back to the 1950s, when nudity was first allowed in cinemas and when media outlets were further allowed to show greater sexuality. Along with greater sexualized media, America's workforce has changed significantly as well. Since the mid-20th century, women's labor force participation has risen from 32% in 1950 to 57% in 2018. And men's participation has fallen from 82% down to 69%. These changes have begun to shift gender role stereotypes from strictly patriarchal society, where men were the primary breadwinner and women were to stay home and take care of their children, to a closer equality between men and women. Of course, this is not to say that gender roles are fully equal. In spite of recent progress being made towards gender equality in America, traditional gender roles and gender inequality in America still exists. In a Pew Research study, twice as many women say that they have experienced workplace discrimination and marginalization than that of men. And this remained pretty consistent throughout different generational gaps. According to a study conducted by Intelligent Groups, a consumer insights company, more than 2/3 of people ages 14 to 34 agree that gender does not have to define a person in the way that it used to. And in that same study, 6 out of 10 say that men and women do not need to conform to traditional gender roles or behaviors anymore. These views have an influence in politics as well. Again, according to a Pew Research Center, Democrats are more than twice as likely as Republicans to say that more work is needed to be done to bring about gender equality. 69% of Democrats feel that the work for gender equality hasn't gone far enough, while only 26% of Republicans feel this way. 49% of Democrats feel that men have it easier than women, and whereas only 19% of Republicans feel this way. These changes in America's gender roles has led to more permissive attitude towards certain sexual behaviors, such as premarital sex and same-sex relations. But interestingly enough, there has been a change, less accepting view of extramarital sexual relations. Research also found an increase in casual sex and number of sexual partners. So defining gender role in America is not necessarily easy, as it has and continually changed between generations and within each culture. But gaining an idea of how these changes have taken place will continue to change, will help in counseling and advocacy efforts.
Following that, we're going to take a look at the resistance and the advocacy efforts. So some resistance, differing opinions. We have a lot of opinions in America, and it's good that a lot of people feel free to express them. This can be influenced by the media and just the religious and social pressure that people feel. And that along comes with the shame and guilt. But we do have a lot of advocacy groups and ways that you can help. Just some of examples of groups is the Gina Davis Institute on Gender and Media and Spark. Those are helping stop the sexualization of women within the media. And then Inspire Framework is looking more at the systematic political change that could happen with that. You can also donate if you don't have the time or the resources to give any other way. And you can vote and educate the people, the students, your family, strangers around you. This leads into the counseling implications. For a school counselor, make sure you leave all of your biases out of the counseling session and let the student present the problem. Make sure you have at your disposal a vast majority and just a knowledge of the resources that you are able to call or that you may need being a school counselor and being exposed to a lot of different types of students. As a mental health counselor, it's better to take a more psychodynamic approach. This is a broader look at counseling that can help you counsel a lot of different types of people. It allows them to develop the skills that they need to handle complicated feelings and be able to process them at the same time. And then looking at family counseling, again, going back to that strength-based approach, but also combining it with a mindfulness, allowing everyone to feel what they feel, but also emphasizing individual strengths that will help them throughout their counseling and their family life. So this concludes the end of our project. These are our 4 demographics, and we had a lot of fun working together, and we hope you liked our presentation.
Absolutely. Thank you, guys.